Alara lived in a town most maps forgot. Cobwebs draped over empty storefronts, and the wind whispered secrets through cracked window panes. It wasn't always this way, she knew. Her parents used to tell stories of bustling market days and lively festivals. But that was before the sickness took them, before the silence settled. Now, Alara was alone, an orphan swallowed by the shadows. She made her home in the old clock tower, the clock long since broken, its hands frozen in a perpetual state of waiting. The tower offered a view of the whole town, a silent panorama of decay. But it also offered something else, a vantage point. Alara wasn't strong, not in the way of soldiers or lumberjacks. But she was clever. Necessity had taught her to be. She learned to hunt rabbits with snares, to mend her own clothes with scavenged thread, to read the weather by the slant of the sun. Most importantly, she learned to listen. The silence of the town wasn't truly silent. It was filled with the rustle of leaves, the creak of old buildings, the distant cry of birds. And Alara heard it all. She knew every loose stone, every hidden path, every secret nook and cranny. She knew the town like the lines on her own hand. Her parents, though gone, had left her a legacy of stories. Tales of heroes and tricksters, of cunning plans and daring escapes. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were lessons. Alara absorbed them, filing them away in the corners of her sharp mind. She knew that brains could be just as powerful as brawn. She spent her days exploring, scavenging, and observing. The townsfolk, what few remained, mostly kept to themselves. They saw her, the quiet girl in the clock tower, but they didn't really see her. They didn't know the wheels that turned behind her watchful eyes. They didn't know the plans that were brewing, waiting for the right moment to hatch. They didn't know that the silence had made her strong. It had made her observant. It had made her ready. The unsettling quiet of the town was shattered one morning by the rumble of wheels and the clatter of hooves. Alara, perched in her clock tower, squinted. A wagon, pulled by two tired-looking horses, lurched into the town square. Behind it came a motley crew of figures, clad in mismatched armor and brandishing rusty weapons. Bandits. They were a scruffy bunch, their faces weathered and scarred. Their leader, a burly man with a thick, tangled beard he probably hadn't washed in months, bellowed orders in a voice that echoed through the empty streets. He was called Gruff, and his name suited him perfectly. "All right, you lot," Gruff roared, his voice rough as gravel. "This town's ours now. We'll be taking what we need, and anyone who gets in our way will regret it." The bandits spread out, kicking open doors and shouting threats. They barged into the bakery, scattering flour and demanding bread. They ransacked the general store, grabbing anything that looked valuable. Their movements were clumsy, their threats loud, but their intent was clear. They were here to take control. Alara watched from her tower, her heart pounding. This wasn't just some passing storm. This was an invasion. The silence she had grown accustomed to was now replaced by the raucous shouts of these unwanted guests. The thought of them rummaging through her town, disturbing the peace, filled her with a quiet fury. Gruff swaggered to the center of the square, planting his boots firmly on the cobblestones. He surveyed his new domain with a smug grin. "This place is a dump," he declared, "but it'll do. Plenty of supplies, and no one to stop us." He was wrong. Alara's hands tightened into fists. She knew that the few remaining townspeople were hiding, terrified. They were no match for these rough bandits. But Alara was different. She had the tower. She had her wits. And she had a town to protect. The stories her father told her about traps, about how even the smallest person can outsmart someone bigger, flooded her mind. She knew what she had to do. The first thing Alara needed was a plan. She couldn't simply charge into the town square and fight them head-on. That would be foolish. She was small, and they were many. But she had something they didn't: knowledge of the town and a quick mind. She raced down the winding stairs of the clock tower, her bare feet silent on the stone. She slipped out into the narrow alleyways, a shadow among shadows. Her first stop was the old blacksmith shop. It had been abandoned for years, but she knew it held treasures. Inside, Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through the broken windows. She rummaged through the debris, her fingers searching for anything useful. She found it, a coil of thick rope, some rusty nails, and a collection of odd-shaped metal scraps. Perfect. Next, she visited the abandoned bakery. The shelves were bare, the ovens cold, but there was still something she could use: flour. Lots of flour. She gathered as much as she could carry in a tattered sack. As she moved through the town, she kept a close watch on the bandits. They were growing bolder, their arrogance increasing with each passing hour. One of them, a skinny fellow with a missing tooth, tried to steal a pie from a windowsill. He tripped over his own feet and landed face first in the dirt, much to the amusement of his companions. They were intimidating, yes, but they were also clumsy and easily distracted. This gave Alara hope. She knew she couldn't defeat them with brute force. She had to use her wits. She had to turn their arrogance against them. She had to make them think they were in control, while all along, she was leading them into her traps. The stories her father told her weren't just about grand heroes. They were about ordinary people using their intelligence to overcome impossible odds. And Alara was determined to become one of those people. Her town depended on it. She was ready to set her plan in motion. The traps would be simple at first, just to test the waters, to gauge their reactions. But they would escalate. She would make sure of it. The first trap was simple: a tripwire stretched across the entrance to the bakery. She used a thick rope she had found in the blacksmith shop, tying it tightly between two sturdy barrels. It was low enough to catch an unsuspecting foot, but high enough to avoid being easily seen. She then sprinkled a thin layer of flour on the ground around the barrels, obscuring the rope even further. Next, she targeted the well. It was the town's only source of fresh water, and she knew the bandits would eventually need to use it. She carefully loosened several of the stones around the well's edge, creating a precarious lip. She covered the loose stones with a layer of leaves and dirt, making it look like solid ground. Anyone stepping too close would find themselves tumbling into the well. Her third trap was more of a distraction. She gathered a pile of old pots and pans from the back of the general store and carefully arranged them on the roof of a nearby building. She attached a rope to the pile, running it down the side of the building and into a hidden alleyway. A simple tug on the rope would send the pots and pans crashing down, creating a loud noise and drawing the bandits' attention. As she worked, Alara felt a surge of adrenaline. She was small, yes, but she was also resourceful. She was scared, but she was also determined. She was doing this for her town, for the memory of her parents, for the hope of a better future. She remembered a story her father used to tell about a tiny mouse that outsmarted a hungry lion. The mouse, though small and weak, used its cleverness to escape the lion's clutches. Alara knew she was the mouse in this story, and the bandits were the lion. But she wasn't afraid. She had her traps, her wits, and her unwavering resolve. With the first 3 traps set, Alara retreated back to the clock tower. She watched from above, her eyes scanning the town square. It wouldn't be long before the bandits stumbled upon her handiwork. And when they did, she would be ready. She would be watching. She would be learning. And she would be planning her next move. The game had begun. It didn't take long. A gruff voice, followed by a loud thud and a string of curses, echoed from the direction of the bakery. Alara peered through her spyglass. One of the bandits, the same skinny one who had tried to steal the pie, was sprawled on the ground, tangled in the rope. He was struggling to get up, his face covered in flour. His companions gathered around, laughing and pointing. "Look at Fingers," one of them jeered. He fell for a simple rope. Fingers, clearly embarrassed, finally managed to untangle himself. He glared at the rope, then kicked it angrily. "Just a bit of bad luck," he mumbled, trying to save face. A few minutes later, another commotion erupted near the well. This time, it was a larger bandit, a brute named Boris, who had gotten too close to the edge while trying to draw water. With a yelp of surprise, he plunged into the well, sending buckets and stones flying. The other bandits rushed to the well, peering down at Boris. "Are you all right, Boris?" Gruff shouted. "I'm Fina." Boris bellowed back, his voice echoing from the bottom of the well. Just get me out of here. The bandits spent the next half hour trying to haul Boris out of the well. They used ropes, buckets, and even a makeshift ladder, but nothing seemed to work. They were a disorganized mess, their earlier confidence replaced by frustration and annoyance. Just as they were about to give up, Ilera decided to spring her third trap. She tugged on the rope leading to the pile of pots and pans on the roof. With a deafening crash, the pots and pans tumbled down, scattering across the square. The bandits jumped in surprise, their heads whipping around. They forgot all about Boris in the well as they tried to figure out what had caused the commotion. Ilera watched from her tower, a small smile playing on her lips. Her traps weren't causing serious harm, but they were disrupting the bandits' plans and eroding their confidence. They were no longer in control. They were starting to look foolish, and that was exactly what she wanted. The next traps will be less about causing minor inconveniences and more about sowing real fear. The game was truly on. Ilera knew she had to press her advantage. While the bandits were still shaken from the pots and pans incident, she began setting her next set of traps. These were a little more elaborate, a little more messy. She located a patch of particularly thick, gooey mud near the old pig pen on the edge of town. Using a shovel she found in the blacksmith shop, she carefully widened the mud pit, making it deeper and more treacherous. Then, she covered the top with a layer of leaves and twigs, disguising it as solid ground. She chuckled to herself, imagining the surprise on some bandit's face when they stepped into her muddy masterpiece. Her next trap involved the town's old bell tower, which stood next to the clock tower. The bell itself was cracked and hadn't rung in years, but the rope that controlled it was still intact. Ilera climbed to the top of the bell tower and tied the rope to a large bucket filled with something unpleasant. She wasn't picky. A mixture of old fish guts, rotten vegetables, and stagnant water would do nicely. The bucket was positioned precariously above the entrance to the bell tower. Anyone entering would get a very smelly surprise. As she was finishing up with the bell tower, she saw Gruff approaching. He was stomping through the town square, his face red with anger. He had clearly had enough of the traps. "All right, you mangy rats," he roared. "I know someone's doing this. Show yourselves, or you'll regret it." Ilera ducked back into the shadows, her heart pounding. She knew she couldn't let him see her. Not yet. Gruff continued to rant and rave, but no one emerged from their hiding places. Frustrated, he turned and started to walk away, heading towards the edge of town. He walked right into the mud pit. With a surprised yell, Gruff disappeared into the mud, sinking up to his waist. He struggled to get out, but the mud was too thick. He just kept sinking deeper and deeper. The other bandits rushed to his aid, but they were too afraid of falling into the mud themselves. They stood at the edge of the pit, offering useless advice and laughing hysterically. Gruff, covered in mud from head to toe, looked utterly defeated. His beard was plastered to his face, and his eyes were wide with panic. "Get me out of here," he pleaded. "I am Sin King." It took the bandits nearly an hour to finally pull Gruff out of the mud pit. He emerged sputtering and covered in muck, the laughingstock of his own crew. Ilera watched from her tower, a triumphant grin on her face. The mighty Gruff, leader of the ruffian bandits, had been brought low by a simple mud pit. Her traps were working, and they were just getting started. The mud pit incident was a turning point. The bandits were no longer just annoyed. They were genuinely worried. They started looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows, and questioning every step they took. Ilera could sense their fear growing, and she knew it was time to escalate things. She focused her attention on the bakery again. This time, she wasn't just setting a simple tripwire. She found a large, rusty flour sifter and rigged it to the ceiling above the main doorway. When someone opened the door, the sifter would release a cloud of flour, blinding and disorienting anyone who entered. She also scattered marbles on the floor inside, creating a slippery surface. In the town square, she used her knowledge of the cobblestone layout to her advantage. She carefully removed several keystones, creating hidden holes that were just big enough to catch a foot. She then covered the holes with thin pieces of wood and a layer of dirt, making them almost invisible. A misstep could result in a twisted ankle or a nasty fall. Near the well, she set up a more elaborate version of her earlier trap. She loosened even more stones around the edge, making the area even more unstable. But this time, she added a net made from old fishing line, suspended just below the surface. Anyone falling into the well wouldn't just get wet, they would be trapped. She also started using sounds to her advantage. She knew the bandits were superstitious, and she used that against them. At night, she would create eerie noises by blowing across the tops of empty bottles or dragging metal scraps across the cobblestones. The sounds echoed through the empty streets, unnerving the bandits and keeping them awake. Gruff, still covered in mud and still the butt of everyone's jokes, was furious. He couldn't figure out who was behind the traps, but he knew they had to be stopped. He gathered his men and launched a search of the town, determined to find the culprit. But Alara was too clever for them. She moved through the shadows like a ghost, always one step ahead. She knew every hiding place, every secret passage, every escape route. She was the master of her domain, and the bandits were just clumsy intruders. She was slowly but surely turning their occupation into a nightmare. The town was fighting back, even if the townspeople didn't know it. And Alara was leading the charge. Gruff was at his wit's end. He had tried everything he could think of to stop the traps, but nothing seemed to work. He had doubled the guard, patrolled the streets day and night, and even threatened to burn the town down if the culprit didn't reveal themselves. But the traps kept coming, each one more ingenious and humiliating than the last. He was convinced that the townspeople were behind it. Who else could it be? But every time he tried to interrogate them, they just stared back at him with blank expressions. They claimed to know nothing, to have seen nothing. He couldn't prove otherwise. They were like shadows, silent and unreadable. He suspected the old woman who ran the apothecary shop. She always seemed to be watching him with those beady eyes of hers. But when he searched her shop, he found nothing but herbs and potions. He also suspected the blacksmith's apprentice, a young man with a quick wit and a rebellious streak. But the apprentice had an alibi for every incident. The truth was, Gruff was starting to lose his grip. He was tired, frustrated, and increasingly paranoid. He couldn't sleep at night, haunted by the eerie noises that echoed through the town. He jumped at every shadow, and he flinched at every sudden sound. His men were starting to lose respect for him. They saw him as weak, as someone who had lost control. "We need to do something, Gruff," Finger said one day. "This can't go on." I know, Gruff snapped. "But what can we do? We tried everything." "Maybe we should just leave," Boris suggested. "This town isn't worth the trouble." Gruff glared at Boris. "Leave? We can't leave. We haven't taken nearly enough loot yet. And besides," he added, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I can't let whoever's doing this win." He paced back and forth, his mind racing. He had to find a way to catch the person behind the traps. He had to find a way to restore order. He had to find a way to regain his authority. He was the leader of the ruffian bandits, and he wouldn't be defeated by some... He didn't even know what. A ghost? A phantom? A clever little annoyance? He just needed bait. Something irresistible. Something a desperate townsperson couldn't refuse. Then he would have them. Then he would make them pay. Alara knew that Gruff was desperate. She had seen the fear in his eyes, the frustration in his face. She knew that he was looking for a way to strike back, to regain control. And she knew exactly how to exploit that desperation. She decided to create a trap specifically designed for Gruff, a trap that would prey on his greed and his arrogance. She needed bait, something irresistible that he couldn't refuse. And then it came to her, treasure. She remembered seeing an old wooden chest in the attic of the general store. It was dusty and forgotten, but it was the perfect size for her plan. She snuck into the store under the cover of darkness, careful to avoid the bandits on patrol. She found the chest in the attic, just as she remembered. It was heavy, but she managed to drag it out of the store and into the alleyway. She filled the chest with worthless trinkets, shiny rocks, broken glass, and bits of colorful cloth. She added a few rusty coins for good measure, just to make it look more convincing. On top of the trinkets, she placed a note, written in shaky handwriting. "To whoever finds this," the note read, "I have hidden a treasure in the old mill. I am too old and weak to retrieve it myself. Please take it, but promise to use it wisely. She knew Gruff wouldn't believe the note, but he wouldn't care. He would see the chest as an opportunity, a chance to prove himself and to regain his authority. She carried the chest to the old mill, a crumbling ruin on the outskirts of town. She placed the chest in the center of the mill, in plain sight. Then, she set her trap. She used the mill's old grinding stone, a massive, circular slab of granite. She rigged it to a rope that was tied to the chest. When someone opened the chest, the rope would be pulled, releasing the grinding stone and sending it crashing down on top of them. It wasn't a deadly trap, but it would certainly immobilize anyone who fell for it. She covered the trap with a layer of leaves and dirt, making it almost invisible. Then, she retreated to the clock tower to wait and watch. She knew that Gruff wouldn't be able to resist the temptation. It was only a matter of time before he took the bait. And when he did, she would be ready. This was her most ambitious trap yet, and she had a feeling it would be her most effective. She was finally going to outsmart Gruff, once and for all. The thought made her smile. Alara didn't have to wait long. The sun had barely risen when she saw Gruff and two of his men, Fingers and Boris, heading towards the old mill. They were armed to the teeth, their faces grim. Gruff, despite his bravado, kept glancing nervously over his shoulder. Alara watched them through her spyglass, her heart pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. The bandits approached the mill cautiously, their weapons raised. Gruff pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. His eyes immediately fell on the treasure chest. A greedy gleam flickered across his face. Well, he said, his voice low and menacing. What do we have here? He approached the chest slowly, his eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of danger. Fingers and Boris stood guard at the entrance, their weapons trained on the surrounding woods. Gruff reached the chest and knelt down beside it. He hesitated for a moment, then reached out and lifted the lid. The grinding stone crashed down. Gruff let out a yell of surprise as the massive stone slammed onto the chest, pinning his arms and legs beneath it. He was trapped. Fingers and Boris rushed into the mill, their eyes wide with panic. They tried to lift the grinding stone, but it was too heavy. They strained and grunted, but the stone wouldn't budge. "Get me out of here!" Gruff roared, his face red with anger and pain. "You idiots! Do something!" Fingers and Boris continued to struggle, but it was no use. They were no match for Alara's trap. Alara watched from her tower, a triumphant smile on her face. Her plan had worked perfectly. Gruff was finally defeated. She slipped out of the clock tower and made her way to the mill. She carried a coil of rope and a sharp knife. When she reached the mill, she found Fingers and Boris still struggling to lift the grinding stone. "Need some help?" Alara asked, her voice clear and confident. The bandits turned to face her, their eyes filled with surprise and confusion. They couldn't believe that the quiet little girl from the clock tower was the one who had been tormenting them all along. "You," Gruff sputtered, his voice muffled by the weight of the grinding stone. "It was you all along." Alara nodded. "That's right, Gruff. It was me." She approached the grinding stone and quickly tied the rope around it. Then, she handed the other end of the rope to Fingers and Boris. "Pull," she said. Together, the bandits hesitated for a moment, then did as she said. They pulled on the rope with all their might, and slowly but surely, the grinding stone began to lift. Once the stone was high enough, Alara slipped underneath it and freed Gruff. He was bruised and shaken, but otherwise unharmed. "Now," Alara said, her voice firm, "it's time for you to leave." Gruff, humiliated and defeated, didn't argue. He knew he had been outsmarted. He also knew that if he stayed any longer, things would only get worse. He glared at Alara, a mixture of anger and grudging respect in his eyes. "Let's go," he barked at his men. "We're leaving this cursed town." The bandits, their morale shattered by Gruff's capture and Alara's revelation, didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled to gather their belongings and hurried towards the edge of town. But Alara wasn't finished yet. She had one more trick up her sleeve. As the bandits fled, they encountered Alara's earlier traps. Fingers, still shaken from his encounter with the grinding stone, tripped over a hidden hole in the town square and twisted his ankle. He yelped in pain and collapsed to the ground, clutching his foot. Boris, trying to avoid the holes, stumbled into the bakery. He didn't see the flour sifter rigged above the doorway. As he pushed open the door, the sifter released a cloud of flour, blinding him and sending him stumbling backwards. He slipped on the marbles scattered on the floor and landed in a heap, covered in flour and bruises. The other bandits, seeing their comrades fall, became even more panicked. They ran blindly through the streets, tripping over tripwires, falling into mud puddles, and getting tangled in ropes. Gruff, watching his men stumble and fall, could only shake his head in disgust. He had never seen such a pathetic display. He had led his men into this town expecting to take what they wanted, but instead, they had been outsmarted by a little girl. He limped towards the wagon, his head hung low. He climbed aboard, grabbed the reins, and whipped the horses into action. The wagon lurched forward, carrying the remaining bandits away from the town. As they drove away, Gruff couldn't help but glance back at the clock tower. He saw Alara standing there, watching them go. She was small and seemingly defenseless, but she had proven to be more than a match for him and his men. He knew he would never forget her, and he knew that he would never underestimate anyone again, especially not a quiet little girl from a forgotten town. The bandits were gone. The town was safe. For now. But Alara knew that her work wasn't finished. She had to make sure that the bandits never came back. She had to make sure that her town was protected, and she knew exactly how to do it. She would rebuild the defenses, strengthen the traps, and train the townspeople to defend themselves. She would turn her town into a fortress, a place that no bandit would ever dare to invade again. The silence would return, but this time it would be a silence of strength, not of fear. As the bandits disappeared over the horizon, a hesitant figure emerged from one of the houses. It was the old woman who ran the apothecary shop, the one Gruff had suspected. She peered around cautiously, her eyes scanning the street. Seeing that the coast was clear, she beckoned to others. Slowly, hesitantly, the townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places. They gathered in the town square, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief. They saw Fingers still clutching his twisted ankle, and Boris covered in flour and bruises. They were too injured to escape. The townspeople, emboldened by the bandits' defeat, surrounded them. "What should we do with them?" someone asked. "Tie them up," another voice shouted, "and throw them in the well." Alara stepped forward, silencing the crowd with a wave of her hand. "No," she said, "we're not like them. We won't resort to violence." She instructed the townspeople to tie up Fingers and Boris, but to treat them with respect. She knew that violence would only breed more violence. She wanted to show the bandits that there was a better way. As the townspeople secured the remaining bandits, they turned to Alara, their eyes filled with awe and gratitude. They had watched her from their hiding places, marveling at her bravery and cleverness. They couldn't believe that a small, orphan girl had managed to defeat a band of hardened criminals. "You saved us," the old woman from the apothecary shop said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You saved our town. We were so scared," the blacksmith's apprentice added. "We didn't know what to do." "But you did," another townsperson said. "You knew exactly what to do." Alara blushed, uncomfortable with the attention. She didn't see herself as a hero. She had just done what she had to do to protect her home. "We need to thank you," the old woman said. "But how can we ever repay you?" Alara thought for a moment. "I don't need to be repaid," she said. "I just want to help rebuild our town. I want to make sure that this never happens again." The townspeople cheered, their voices filled with renewed hope. They knew that with Alara leading the way, they could rebuild their town and create a better future for themselves. They finally understood that the quiet little girl in the clock tower wasn't just a shadow in the background. She was their protector, she was their leader, and she was their hero. They were ready to follow her, wherever she led. The silence of fear had been broken, replaced by the sounds of hope and determination. The days that followed were filled with activity. The townspeople, inspired by Alara's example, worked together to repair the damage caused by the bandits. They patched up roofs, cleaned up the streets, and replanted the gardens. Alara, with her knowledge of the town and her knack for problem-solving, took charge of the rebuilding efforts. She organized work crews, delegated tasks, and ensured that everyone had what they needed. She also started teaching the townspeople how to defend themselves. She showed them how to set simple traps, how to use makeshift weapons, and how to work together as a team. She wanted to empower them, to give them the skills and the confidence to protect their home. The town began to change. The empty storefronts were filled with new businesses. The streets were filled with laughter and chatter, and the town square was once again a place of gathering and celebration. The silence of fear had been replaced by the sounds of hope and resilience. Alara was no longer alone. She had found a family in the townspeople, and they had found a leader in her. She still lived in the clock tower, but now it was a symbol of hope, not of isolation. One evening, as the sun set over the town, the townspeople gathered in the square. They had built a small stage, and they had invited Alara to speak. She stood before them, her heart filled with gratitude. She had never imagined that she could be a leader, that she could inspire others. But she had learned that even the smallest person can make a difference, that even the quietest voice can be heard. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for working together. Thank you for making our town safe again." The townspeople cheered, their voices echoing through the square. They knew that Alara was more than just a hero. She was their friend, their confidant, and their inspiration. She had shown them that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. From that day forward, the town was known as Alara's town, a testament to the bravery and cleverness of the quiet orphan girl who had saved them all. The town was safe, not because of walls or weapons, but because of the spirit of its people, a spirit that had been ignited by a small girl with a big heart and an even bigger brain. And Alara, no longer alone in the shadows, finally found her place in the sun.